Good evening, everyone, or good morning, or good afternoon, whichever part of the world you are in. I'm Harpreet Kaur, Business and Human Rights Specialist at United Nations Development Program Asia Pacific. Thank you for joining us today. Do you know how many people Google business and human rights? Well, almost none. Instead, they search for the names of the video games, movie stars, sports stars, and actors. People are less likely to search for People are likely to search for the best exfoliator and bucket hat than human rights. So, how do we tell our stories? Social media has changed the way we communicate and engage. Due to the widespread reach and effective penetration of social media in people's lives, lifted by the smartphone revolution and improved internet penetration, consumers are no longer passive. They are connecting and consuming information like never before. Facebook alone has 2.6 billion users globally, of which 1.2 billion are just in Asia Pacific. Add to this 2 billion users on YouTube, 1.7 billion Instagram users, 187 million on Twitter, and others on various social media platforms and smartphone apps. An additional 207 million Netflix subscribers and 126 million subscribers of Prime Video. In other words, if you look at the reach of social media, it could very well be another world out there. To this, add traditional media, roughly about 33,000 television radio stations and 44,000 radio stations in the world. India alone has 118,000 registered newspapers and publications. So, what I'm trying to say here is that the reach of media is far and wide, and very few remain untouched by its impact in today's world. The media, thus, can have a huge impact in educating and informing the public and can perform the role of agenda setting. It can be an agent of change, an agent of disruption, but with this reach comes the responsibility. The speakers at the session today will discuss the role of media and communications in promoting business and human rights agenda. And with that, I would like to welcome our esteemed panelists for this session. We have with us today Irit Tamir, Director, Private Sector Department, Oxfam America; Margie Mason, a Pulitzer Prize winner journalist at Associated Press; Priyanka Dutt, Country Director, BBC Media Action India, Priyanka Mogul, Media Manager, Business and Human Rights Resource Center; Rosebal Kagumer, Curator and Editor, AfricanFeminism.com; Tun Pinocchi, Founder and Director of Strategy at Sidekick. Special thanks to Irit for joining us early morning and Margie for joining us almost midnight. I must say, I'm particularly thrilled moderating this session today, as I've had the privilege of working both with BBC Media Action, where I started my career years ago, and with the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, where I learned my first lessons on the subject. A general announcement for the participants today. Participants can ask questions using the Q&A function on the right side of the platform. And with that, we would like to start the session today. Welcome panelists and welcome participants. Can we play the video, please? Thank you.
छत्तीसगढ़ के 63 बंधुआ मजदूरों को जम्मू कश्मीर के नौशहरा तहसील के झंझड़ गांव से मुक्त कराया गया। मजदूरों के मुताबिक पिछले 8 महीनों से मजदूरों को बंधक बनाकर रखा गया था। उन्हें न तो रोजी दी जा रही थी, न ही खाने।
बचपन से एक मन में रहता ना कि कुछ करना है, समाज से हमेशा हम लोग लेते हैं, देते क्या है। इसलिए मैंने जर्नलिज्म का फील्ड चुना और यहाँ रहकर के कोशिश होती है कि इनके लिए कुछ किया जा सके। मुझे मेरे फ्रेंड ने बताया कि बीबीसी कुछ इस तरह के प्रोग्राम ऑर्गेनाइज करता है जहाँ पर बॉन्डेड लेबर्स को लेकर बातचीत होती है, बताया जाता है कि जर्नलिस्ट को किस तरह से बॉन्डेड लेबर्स के बारे में रिपोर्टिंग करनी है। तो मैंने कुछ मजदूरों पर स्टोरी की हुई थी, तो मैंने कहा मैं भी इंटरेस्टेड रहता हूँ इन चीज़ों में। बॉन्डेड लेबर्स को लेकर के एक गहन सोच जो जगानी चाहिए हमारे अंदर, वो चीज़ वहाँ पर देखने को मिली। और सबसे महत्वपूर्ण बात कि इस तरह की चीज़ें लोगों के सामने आएगी कैसे, एनजीओ से संपर्क कैसे करना है, एनजीओज आपके कैसे फ्रेंडली हो सकते हैं रिपोर्टिंग करने में, इस चीज़ को काफ़ी अच्छे तरीके से वहाँ पर सिखाया गया और एक अच्छा अनुभव रहा हम लोगों को। हेलो, जम्मू कश्मीर से कुछ एनजीओ वर्कर्स का हमारे पास कॉल आया कि छत्तीसगढ़ के 63 मजदूर जम्मू कश्मीर में बंधक हैं। तो पता लगा कि वहाँ पर महिलाएं काम कर रही हैं, उनके साथ बच्चे हैं और उन्हें कई महीनों से वहाँ पर रखा गया है। उसके आधार पर फिर हमने रिपोर्टिंग की शुरुआत की और जो ट्रेनिंग में हमने जो कुछ सीखा था कि किन किन चीज़ों पर ध्यान रखने की ज़रूरत है, किन किन चीज़ों को सामने लाने की ज़रूरत है, उन चीज़ों को सामने रखा और आखिरकार लगातार रिपोर्टिंग के बाद सरकार ने अपनी टीम भेजी और टीम भेज करके उनको वहाँ से मुक्त कराया गया।
जैसे कोई बंधुआ मजदूर अगर मुक्त होता है,
एक मजदूर को छुड़ा लेना, 63 मजदूर ले आना, 102 मजदूर ले आना, उनका पुनर्वास करा देना, यहाँ पर काम खत्म नहीं होता है क्योंकि बंधुआ मजदूरी कोई छोटी समस्या नहीं जिसको एक दिन में या 2 दिन में खत्म किया जा सके या 1-2 रिपोर्टिंग में ही हम ये मान के चले कि हमारा काम पूरा हो गया, क्योंकि बड़ी जिम्मेदारी है। ये तो एक शुरुआत है, ये सफ़र तब तक जारी रहेगा जब तक हर एक मजदूर को संविधान में जो अधिकार दिए गए हैं उसके बारे में वह जान नहीं लेता और उसको संविधान का पूरा अधिकार नहीं मिल जाता।
Thank you. And with that, I would like to invite Priyanka, first of all. Priyanka, thanks for allowing us to share this video. Now, this was one of the most successful campaigns at the BBC Media Action. Tell us more about this initiative and how BBC Media Action uses media and communications to achieve development goals. Priyanka, the floor is yours.
So much, Harpreet, and apologies for those of you who may not have been able to read the subtitles. I certainly couldn't see them because there was a sort of a super across it. So let me then quickly tell you what the program was about and what Devesh Tiwari, the journalist in that film, was talking about. This was work that we did in India almost about 5 years ago now is when it finished, looking at the prevention of bonded labor and focusing particularly on the most marginalized communities, largely tribal, in fact, who were most vulnerable to being bonded, but also had the least access to information, had the least access to media and communication. A particularly challenging task for a media and communication project. What we did in this case was we wanted to make sure that we were able to sort of let people know what their rights were, what their entitlements were, what the law said about what they, how they were going to be protected. But also we wanted to create ways for them to recognize their own vulnerability where it existed and find ways, both individually and collectively, to protect themselves and look at how they could actually set things in motion for themselves that would make sure that they were not going to be in vulnerable situations when they left looking for work. And as a result, what we did really was we started with a radio program that wasn't actually broadcast on radio. So it was a radio style program, but that was executed through what we ended up calling listeners' villages. And it took the concept of a listeners' group, so a small group of people who sit down to listen to content and then discuss it. And we basically expanded that to include 50% of the households in a village who then had an opportunity at different times in the week to listen to this program and sit down and discuss what it said. Now, what did that content actually say? The content came from the stories from within those communities. So these were stories that people were deeply familiar with. They were stories of things that had happened to their neighbors, to their family members. And what the radio program did was it represented those stories with potential sort of solutions for people to consider that gave people something to think about and something to discuss with other people in their village. We also, in order to do this, to deliver the listeners' village concept, we worked with civil society organizations who were deeply embedded in those communities already. So rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, we went with people who were already familiar to the communities that we were working with. And so BBC Media Action sort of stayed almost in the background of that conversation. In order to kind of expand that and make it much larger than just focused on those 110 listeners' villages that we worked in, we partnered with several media houses in the states that we were operating in and trained 100 journalists, not just in the BBC's approach to looking at sort of editorial journalism, but also in matters of bonded labor and labor rights. And we connected them, we trained them side by side with the civil society partners that we worked with, thus creating sort of synergies and creating partnerships that have survived 5 years down the line, even after the project has ended, after our interactions have ended. And it was that partnership between civil society and media that led to an increase, a pretty significant increase, 400 articles on bonded labor issues and labor rights issues published in the space of 1 year, because there were these partnerships that were completely sort of organically generating stories for each other. It was also that sort of engagement with the media that allowed civil society organizations who identified situations where people were vulnerable or had been in a bonded situation to put pressure on the system to really create possible.
Priyanka, we are unable to hear you. Okay, so while we are waiting for Priyanka to come back, Margie, I'm going to move on to you because, in some ways, the outcome of your work isn't different from what BBC Media Actions Project did, that helped freed bonded laborers. However, you used an entirely different form of media. Your investigative series on slavery in the fishing trade reportedly led to rescue of over 2,000 workers. Tell us, how did it all start? What were some of the key challenges that that you faced in reporting a story such as powerful but also as difficult to cover as well? Over to you, Margie.
Thank you so much for having me. We also were working on our project. I think we started maybe way back in 2013, and we published in 2015. And so, we had been working, my colleague, Robin McDowell, and I had been working in Southeast Asia as foreign correspondents for many, many years in various countries. And, we had often heard these stories about fishermen who were being trapped, or on these floating prisons at sea. And, we really kind of started, looking into this. And I was in Indonesia at the time, and, we ended up finding that these Thai boats from, Samut Sakhon in Thailand, there was this long history of, workers, mainly, poor migrant workers from Burma, Cambodia, Thailand, and Laos, who were being trafficked and sold. And this had been going on for decades. I mean, we often refer to it as an open secret. And, for those of you who are from Southeast Asia or have worked there, many people had heard stories about these fishermen who were trapped at sea, sometimes for a very long time. And, it's one of those things that, like, as a journalist, I think oftentimes, we had people tell us, well, that's an old story. You really shouldn't. People have written about that, workers who have escaped or come home. You should look at something else. You're wasting your time on this. And we really thought, this is something that we should look more closely at. So we really kind of used our investigative skills on this. And then we decided to kind of turn it upside down a little bit. And we ended up, after months and months and months of kind of digging, we ended up finding this island in Indonesia, in the Maluku island chain, called Benjina. And it was so remote and so small that even the Indonesians in my office, they'd never heard of it, and we had to try to find it on the map. And we were hearing stories that there could be men who were there and trapped. And we used a lot of technology. So we were looking online and kind of following ships that were moving between Thailand and Indonesia. We were looking at their routes. We were seeing that they were going there. And when we got there, we found that there were a lot of men and they were desperate. We had, men begging us for help. They told us horrific stories of, some of them had been at sea for years. They, had not been in touch with their families. They assumed their families thought they were dead. They were handing us pictures of themselves and saying, please contact my mother. Here's my picture. Tell her I'm alive. Tell her where I am. We found a graveyard with all of these names that were Thai names. But, the workers who were there said, no, this is my friend and he's Burmese and he was buried here. So people had died, were buried under fake names, because the Thai fishing industry, they needed to have on the books anyway, Thai workers on the ships. So in addition to that, we've actually found men who were in a cage. There was a company compound there and they would take these men, and as, if they were, for whatever reason, if they weren't working hard enough, or if there were any kind of, for whatever reason, they would put them in this, jail, basically of sorts, and keep them there. It was very small. It was, filthy. And, again, this was a form of punishment. They were beaten, men were killed, they were thrown overboard, they would die, they would be tossed in the freezers of the ships. They weren't being paid. It was the worst. It was slavery. And so we then went to Samutsakan, and we saw the fish being loaded onto the big ships. And we followed them again through the technology. We saw when they were going to Thailand. We then physically went to Thailand and we followed the trucks as this fish was being unloaded, because we wanted to then follow the supply chain. So as the fish was being unloaded, we followed these trucks all over in the middle of the night in Thailand. And we eventually then were able to use U.S. Customs records to link the fish from Thailand back to some of the biggest companies in the U.S., Europe, and many other places. So we, Walmart, some of the big cat food, Fancy Feast, Meow Mix, many of the big companies, restaurants that are very popular here. Pretty much every grocery store chain in America. And so we then looked at this from all 50 states and really were able to, at that point, connect these men who were in cages in Benjina to the American consumer, who, the people who were buying this. And it really, when the story was published, at the time, the fishing minister, in Indonesia was very strong. She had just come in and she immediately took action, and they went to find out if this was true. When they got there and confirmed that it was true, they immediately evacuated the men and started working to repatriate them. And then they went to neighboring islands and they found, I think, there were more than 2,000 men who were repatriated. And one man that I talked to had been enslaved and stuck in Indonesia for 22 years. So I think the story had enormous impact. There have been, laws were changed, laws that are being used now. A loophole, actually, President Obama closed a loophole in a law, basically banning anything made with forced labor from entering the U.S. And we did another project last year on the palm oil industry. And through that reporting, we also found grave labor abuses. And the U.S. government, right after we published, they banned all palm oil from two of the biggest palm oil producers in Malaysia and in the world. So I think what I would say is that, you can use investigative reporting. And again, you can take a story that some people might not see and you can turn it upside down and show it in a different way. I think a lot of times you just have to think about stories and really how to present them and how to make people connect. This is a global world. And if you show people, in America, how they're connected to this little island, Indonesia, and the people who are, obviously, encountering just enormous, pain and misery from this work, you can really make a difference.
Thanks, Margie. Thanks, Margie. And I see Priyanka is back with us. Priyanka, I'm just going to hand it over to you before we move on to the next panelist.
Thank you so much, and apologies for having quickly suddenly disappeared off the call. I think, Margie, that was a fascinating story, and thank you for the work that you do. And I think it was that we were trying to achieve through the Bonded Labor Project as well, is to really empower journalists to do the same kind of reporting. And at the same time, use media and communications in a slightly different way, which is to really provide information and create a stimulus that allows people to sort of empower themselves and to seek solutions for themselves that really will help them protect themselves. And we heard sort of similar stories as well on the Bonded Labor Project. It was called Majboor Kisko Bola, which translated is "Who are you calling helpless?" And Majboor, if you change the B to a D, the word Majdoor in Hindi is labor or laborer. So it was an interesting sort of play on labor versus vulnerability. And what we found was some incredible stories that we weren't really expecting, to be honest, because we built into the program, for example, a missed call number primarily designed to get feedback from the communities about what they were hearing about the content, and for them to tell us more stories that we could sort of repurpose and put into the content. And we very quickly started to hear stories of, worrying stories. People were raising grievances. They were coming to us with sort of questions about, this is what's happened to my brother or my, uncle or friends in my community, and do you think they're in trouble? And while we're not an organization that works in rescue and rehabilitation, we had a sort of a moral and ethical responsibility to do something about this. So we then took that back to the civil society partners that we were working with. And through that approach, again, because they had built these relationships and these partnerships with the media, they were able to sort of come together. So community, civil society organizations, and the media were able to come together and put pressure on the system, on government administrators and police officials and people who needed to take action. And through that action, we saw in the course of a year over 200 people rescued from being bonded, which was quite an incredible story. We also heard fantastic stories about how women figured out through this process that they had other opportunities to come together and buy themselves out of situations that left them indentured. So, women coming together to create self-help groups where they were able to sort of participate in micro savings and put together a little bit of money that would help them slowly buy themselves out of penury and out of this enslaved sort of situation that they were in, and therefore actually breaking that generational chain that had been handed down to them. So it's incredible what you can do with the effective use of media and communication, even in a community where we were working was completely media dark. They had no access to television, no access to the radio, no access to mobile phones. And for those of you who are familiar with cricket in India, there were communities that hadn't heard of Sachin Tendulkar, who is pretty much God when it comes to Indian cricket. So it was, we were talking about really, really marginalized communities, but the power of media to be able to tell stories, tell their own stories, and use that really as a way of getting people to think and discuss things to be able to protect themselves is what was really exciting about that project.
Thanks, Priyanka. So what I'm hearing here is building capacities of the civil society organizations and the journalists, at the same time, but then working with the communities so that everybody, so that these different groups are also able to communicate and complement each other's in finding solutions. But one of the things that I really that I've heard from both of you is how are you using the information for empowerment, and how having access to that information in an easy way, understandable way, how that is affecting communities to be empowered in itself as well. I'm now going to move on to Irit. Oxfam has led successful advocacy and communication campaigns. There have been many campaigns from Oxfam, and behind the barcodes being one of those. Uh, Irit, would you tell us more about this campaign? I think particularly how you use media and communications to strengthen your programmatic efforts in holding corporates accountable. The floor is yours, Irit. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me here today, and it's a pleasure to hear these stories that others have been telling as well. As I hope most people know, Oxfam is an international development and humanitarian organization. We work around the world to eliminate poverty. And about 3 years ago, in 2018, we launched a campaign called Behind the Barcodes, which looked at 16 global food retailers that are operating mostly in northern markets like the United States, Germany, the Netherlands, and the UK. Companies like Walmart and Tesco's, for example, or Aldi or Ahold. And these are, of course, companies that source food from around the world. And Behind the Barcodes is a campaign that follows another campaign we did in 2013 to 2016 called Behind the Brands, which was a campaign that targeted the top 10 food and beverage companies like Coca-Cola, Nestle, and Pepsi. And I mention that because both campaigns utilize similar ways of using media and have a similar theory of change. And essentially, what we were trying to do in both campaigns and continue to do in Behind the Barcodes is to really spark a race to the top in relation to issues of sustainability and human rights. So we were really trying to get the companies to compete on their policies and practices related to human rights in the same way that they compete on product. And we did this by creating a scorecard in both campaigns. And the scorecard really analyzed both the policies and practices of these companies. In Behind the Barcodes, the campaign focused on 4 themes: transparency, workers, smallholder farmers, and women, and are really looking to empower rights holders at the end of these supply chains, where our food is really produced and processed. And we do this in a whole host of ways, as I mentioned, first through a scorecard. So we really try to sensitize the company around the issues that we want to see them improve upon. So we create a whole host of benchmarks and indicators in a scorecard. We do that, of course, with expertise from allies on these various issues and with civil society organizations on the ground. We then dialogue with the companies around the scorecard, trying to get them to understand what it is we want them to do. We then set a deadline for them to make their policies and practices publicly available, and then we assess them in the scorecard according to those publicly available data. Because that is a big part of the theory of change, is making these policies and practices publicly available and transparent to rights holders, so that not just Oxfam, but others around the world can hold these companies to account in relation to their policies. Then we publish those scores. In addition, we do research on the ground, and that's really where the stories of rights holders comes in, because the idea is to really show where the gaps in these policies are, and we do that by working with civil society organizations in countries to highlight the gaps in these policies and to show where there are human rights risks. So we've worked with communities in Thailand and seafood. And while many have told the story of people on vessels, we have focused on women who often are in the processing plants of shrimp processing, for example, women who oftentimes have to work overtime to be able to even have a decent pay, who often face sexual harassment and discrimination by virtue of their gender, who often go hungry, frankly, because they don't make enough money working in these positions. So we really try to focus on some of the stories that have been untold in these supply chains. We've worked with communities in India and tea plantations. Again, often women who are picking the tea in those plantations, or women who work in the vineyards harvesting grapes for wine in South Africa. And the idea here, as I said, is to really show to the companies that there are human rights risks that they have not addressed in order to get them to change their policies and their practices. We regularly update the scorecard in order to then give companies credit when they do make commitments throughout the campaign. And a big part of the campaign is celebrating with the company when they do make commitments. We've used a number of media tools in these campaigns, including videos to get supporters and consumers engaged in the campaign, and to really highlight the brand risk for the company. So we will often use their brands in those videos or in our actions so that others within the company see a reputational risk related to these human rights. We do a lot of storytelling, again, lifting up the voices of the rights holders, a lot of online and offline actions. In the US, for example, we rented a food truck and did a whole food tour to highlight the plight of food workers in these supply chains and to tell the story of these food workers. And of course, social media is a massive tool that we use in these campaigns to engage consumers and supporters. In addition to that, we do quite a bit of shareholder advocacy and investor advocacy in order to get others that are interested in these companies engaged and highlighting the risks for the company. And frankly, Behind the Brands was able to get quite a number of commitments from the top 10 food and beverage companies. The campaign did not go away after 2016. It was not as publicly visible, but what we then did was go into what we called an implementation phase, really holding the companies to account, monitoring then how they implemented those policies in key sourcing countries and tracking that implementation. And recently we just came out with a report that sort of wrapped up all those commitments that came due in 2020 from that campaign, called Shining a Spotlight, which you can find on our website, and really talks about how companies implemented or didn't implement the commitments that they made. We'll do the same thing with Behind the Barcodes once that public phase of the campaign is over. But in the meantime, we continue to highlight it publicly. So that's how we use storytelling and media in our campaigns.
Thanks, Sarita. I think really interesting insights on how you've used, the race to top approach, particularly bringing out companies to share their data and information publicly as well. I'll come back to you on specifically, on race to the top, but I would first like to move on to Rosebell. You have researched and published on issues such as discrimination, rights of the migrants, digital democracy, peace and conflict. I mean, all of these are very, very complicated and complex issues. Um, so we would like to hear from you, Rosebell. How does one simplify these issues enough for a layman to understand and engage, yet maintain the nuances that it requires? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Greetings from Dakar, Senegal.
Rosebell, I can't hear you. Maybe you need to unmute yourself. We could hear you and then
I'm sorry.
it went quiet. Sure, please.
Oh,
Sorry, we'll have
sorry.
to repeat it since you muted yourself in between.
Okay. I was talking about the kind of work we do in terms of tracking down feminist movements and the push for changes every day in different African countries. So looking at how do you simplify, complex issues for ordinary people to understand and engage, I think it's very important to understand the role of storytelling and to know that at the heart of communications, you're trying to tell a story, you're trying to bring either a story that is already known and continuous, and we have to fight complacence, but also looking at new ways, because when we talk about rights, there's always new violations, there's always new understanding of rights in a community internationally. And even when you look at the genesis of what we understand as rights, 50 years ago, the kind of normalization of certain exclusion of people is different today. So we constantly, it's very important to look at who is on the outside, who is excluded, even when you think that the right is already normalized. So for me, it's very important to understand that we are trying to tell a story, and we are trying to get this story to the different audience, but also there are people at the heart of this story, and understanding language. Because often understanding, for example, on migrants' rights or on racial justice, for example, very often people don't even understand, they don't know, they don't have the language. They understand that a violation is happening to them, but they actually don't have the language to describe, for them to communicate what exactly is going on. So I think it's very important to connect with storytellers, people who are defining, who are giving us language. We always forget the language we use, that people have put in work to actually describe these things and give us the tool, because language is a tool, and also deconstruct existing language that dehumanizes people, that takes away people's rights. So being constantly aware of what is the new language we can use to empower, but what is old language we need to throw away, that we need to interrogate and say we can no longer use this kind of language. And a lot of times in the development sector, there's language that is still very exclusionary, and this it does not look like it puts agency of the people at the heart of it. So the continuous conversation around what kind of language do we use, I think is a very important one. And then on the reach, we have to reach people at their point of understanding. Sometimes we come with ideas of understanding an issue, but then we forget that there are existing narratives and understandings within communities, that we have to step out of an industry kind of language and come to understand people's language. What is the language they express themselves in? How would they describe the violations? How would they describe the solutions to these issues? And translate a lot of these mechanisms that we are using to communicate into people's languages, but at the same time find out existing already mechanisms and concepts of rights that we can then be able to communicate in and find people at the level that they would truly grasp and understand the issue. And the other aspect I wanted to talk to is about understanding that we're trying to tell to describe rights, communicate on rights, and in a very challenging context with histories and hierarchies, be it gender hierarchies, be it colonial hierarchies. So we need to constantly be aware of the different dispositions that are in the society, and who has access to the medium, and some things can can appear simple to a certain group, but then they're actually not that simple because of these different hierarchies and how they affect people's access to their rights, but also access to platforms and voice. So understanding voice for me is very important, and working daily, not just in saying, okay, I have a campaign, I want to go today and do this, but be plugged in everyday realities and know what is the story today, who is driving the story, rather than saying, this is my organization's story, we did at this place, we did this and we did that. I often find it like, at the end of the day, it's people's stories, people's experiences. So maybe if we try to look more, rather than saying, this is our organizational story, this is what we found out. I think it's very important to know that these are people's experiences. They have already found out before you found out, and then try to communicate in ways that how they would track down that. I think we put a lot of hierarchies of like, I'm the one who found this, and I am, and this is, it's very important to recognize like these kind of things, but it's also realize if you're going to communicate on a daily basis that there's been people talking about this issue every day, especially the people in that particular community. So for me, social media, for example, gives us this kind of incredible inroad into communities, into different issues that every day in my work, if I want to know what's happening in Burkina Faso, I look up women in Burkina Faso online who are speaking out, who are talking about these issues, so that when we have a story from there, it is their story, it is them understanding the context and bringing it, and then we're building up, building with these stories, we are building with the people who are at the heart of this story. So I think that looking at incredibly centering audiences and looking at them as part of the production of your everyday issue is very, very important. And social media gives us that connectivity that we have not had before. And at least in my work every day, I rely heavily on social media to track down voices who people are already doing this, who are they've already simplified it, and how do we learn from them on the forefront and bring in maybe the larger context and the more nuance and connecting the dots. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for highlighting the importance of language and importance of particularly language in communications. In fact, one of the reasons that this forum is being all the sessions in this forum are featured in 12 languages is only because I think we realize that these are the major barriers. We need to break the language barriers. And I think, Rosebell, what you said about putting people and prioritizing people and putting them at the center of the stories is just so much important than putting any of our organizations or our different agendas in there. Thank you for making those important interventions. Priyanka, I'm going to move over to you, Priyanka Mogul. We have two Priyankas on our panel today. Business and Human Rights Resource Center has its own very unique approach in using publicly available information to advocate with companies and create pressure to take action. Would you share some of these approaches with us, and what has been your experience, particularly in engaging with the companies? Do you see when you use these approaches, do you see that the companies are opening their door, or is it like a roadblock and that's where you find difficulty? Over to you, Priyanka.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the Business and Human Rights Center is quite uniquely placed in terms of we have a very evidence-based approach to tackling human rights. I'm quite happy to kind of follow on from Irit and Rosabelle, because I kind of see us as being a middleman of those two very important things. So on the data-driven side, we focus very heavily on what we call our company response mechanism. This is, it operates in all the regions that we operate in. It's available in 10 languages. But what it is when a specific allegation of misconduct or abuse is made against a company, and we find that the company has not responded to that specific allegation, we step in and approach them for that response. And to us, it's really important that this response is seen very quickly and very directly with the companies almost as soon as the allegation of abuse is made. And I think this all comes back to just making sure that there's corporate transparency at the heart of business and human rights. Our role is seen very much as turning up the pressure on these companies. We do a lot of sort of in-depth reports, but the company response mechanism allows us to pick up on these issues that some might think are smaller issues or issues that don't deem a company response, we don't really see it that way. We see our tool as something that provides civil society with all the allegations made against a company and all their responses. So if you go to our website, you can type in a company's name and look at their history and how they've responded to these allegations. And for me, as sort of media officer, I think that provides really useful context for journalists when they're reporting not only on human rights issues, but on companies in general. So we'll work a lot with journalists whose beat is fashion, who do a lot of work reporting on fashion companies, not necessarily reporting on these allegations, but we try and show them that these companies that you report on also have a history of being engaged in some really serious allegations. We also have a very close relationship with journalists where when they're unable to get a response from companies, we sometimes can step in and play that role. But equally responding to allegations of abuse that are made in the media and making sure that we're approaching companies to seek a response to those allegations. At the same time, kind of coming back to what Rosabelle said, we're very aware of the people behind these data points. And I was quite happy to join the Resource Center and realize that it's not always about our media coverage. It's not an aim to get us into the media. And when we are in the media, I'm never the spokesperson for whatever the issue is that we're being approached for. It's always our regional researchers. It's always people who are on the ground, who are experts. And my role is very much just to connect the right journalist to the right expert. And that is something that is really, really, really important to us. It just means that amplifying voices of communities, especially those who are impacted, that's one of our strategic priorities. So they're very much focused on the victim-focused approach to human rights. But when we talk about remedy and what companies are doing to right these abuses, we don't talk about just what they're doing. We talk about whether the remedy is satisfactory to the workers who've been impacted. And so we're really looking for the media to start looking at these issues in the same way, and recognizing that it's the worker voices that have to come at the top. We personally don't believe that all media coverage is good media coverage. We're quite strategic about the sort of media coverage that we put out. We prefer to work quite closely with journalists. A lot of our researchers have a very sort of close personal relationship with them. I very much advocate for sort of longer off-the-record conversations that can provide context. And when we do have a launch of something, usually our press releases will be very tailored to different journalists. We just released a benchmark on forced labor in the apparel and footwear industry, and we had 5 different press releases just to make sure that we're pulling out the right set of information for the right journalists. And so my advice to people who are reporting on these issues is to sort of figure out what your audience is and what angle you think will have the most impact when you report on these issues. If your audience is more of a general public, maybe you're looking at an angle of consumer pressure. But for the financial publications, we try and make them put the pressure on investors instead. Who are the investors who are investing in these companies? Do they know about the allegations of their portfolio companies? And so for us, as well as the journalists, it's very much about sort of understanding our unique position within the human rights issue that we're working on. As a former journalist, I'm very aware of time pressure on journalists these days. I think it's amazing that Margie was able to do that investigative work, and I just wish that more journalists had the bandwidth to do that. And so I think we are very much also focused on how can we make this easy and not too time consuming, but make sure that journalists get the full context and the understanding of these issues, because there really is so much nuance that doesn't go into a press release. And I personally find that the best pieces of coverage we get are when the journalist has had at least a few conversations with our experts, rather than just lifting information from a press release. So I think it's always just to have that worker voice at the heart of your story. We're quite proud to be the people who will pass you on to people who can be a spokesperson who are not us. If we think there's someone who is better placed, we're happy to do that. So I think we really see ourselves as a resource for journalists rather than being the people who can talk on these things quite expertly.
Thanks, Priyanka. And with that, I would actually move on to Tun Pinkau, because what I'm hearing is putting people at the center, putting workers' voices, putting the affected communities at the center. Well, Tun, and I've been working in the development sector for years now, and I'm just sort of saying by my own experience, and I think all of us feel the same way, is for us, every story is like a success story. We kind of feel like this is a story that needs to be told, this is a story that needs to go out in media. And at the same time, having interacted with journalists, it seems like, well, this is the same story that your organization and 15 other organizations are telling us every single day. So I think my question for you would be, is given your experience and the kind of work that you do, what do you think, what would you say are the key lessons for campaigners to produce content that is newsworthy but also engaging at the same time? Over to you then.
How are you? Hi, everyone. So, yeah, thank you so much for the question. So, yeah, my name is Tun. We're from a social change agency called Sidekick. So we work across Asia, creating, positive change through collaboration and co-creation. So, when we're looking at engaging or creating engaging campaigns, and as well as making it newsworthy, the first thing that we do is we look at audience. That's the first thing we tackle. That's the first question we always ask audience. And that's something we always talk to clients about. Can you, try to put yourselves in the shoes of the audience? And the audience, there's two types of audience for us. There's the mass audience, which prefer a more simple message. And then there's the experts, the academics. Sometimes the media, especially beat journalists, who've been following an issue for a long time. So that's more of a complex message. So when we create or design campaigns, we think about both of these groups. How we engage with them, each group is different depending on the complexity of the message. So if I can give an example, a campaign that we worked on in reintegrating former female offenders back into society. So within the same space, within the same event, we created two distinct activities. One was designed for the mass public, a street food fair where ex-offenders could launch their products and innovation to the public. There was also a concert where female ex-offenders, influencers, a concert that people could enjoy and understand the issue in a more kind of relaxed way. And that in the same space, in the same time, there's also we organized a TED Talk for business leaders to express their commitments and their active support to create the best chance in life for ex-offenders. So within this same space, we provided, for the public to engage, as well as the media from different beats, different interests could engage in different issues, and actually engage, not just talk about problems, but also solutions. So that's something that we're really keen on in talking about when we design activities or engagement, is talking about both problems and finding ways of to talk about solutions. And the other thing is, voices from disenfranchised communities. So voices that journalists can actually speak to, can get information directly from. And all this is packaged in a new sort of innovative way that it's different, and people get the information that they need. They can join, they can be part of the campaign. We can mobilize them, but also the press from different types of beats can also get information and understand the issue. So that's kind of how we see a lot of the campaigns and how we design our campaigns. Another tool that we use a lot in our design of interventions is co-creation. So when we're designing a campaign, a lot of the time we co-create with the audience themselves. So an example could be a campaign that we've been working on with IOM, with UN Women, around women migrant workers accessing support for violence and exploitation. So what we did was we wanted to understand how they would access information, the ways that they access and enjoyed sharing information. So what we did was we spent time with them. So we spent time in their house, in their homes, and when they took breaks, we went to temples with them. So we tried to understand what really influences them. We found that music was a key influence in their life. They only had a few hours a day breaks after work, and that most of the time was spending listening to music, and a specific type of music as well. EDM music. I'm sure you guys have heard of EDM, or electronic dance music. So they enjoyed electronic dance music together with sort of a country music twist to it. So what we did was we brought the migrant workers to create this EDM mix, and we launched this product to migrants, and it was such an amazing success. People were writing down numbers hotlines because they've never heard anything that's kind of specifically created for them. And it was something that they could enjoy, something that they could share among their networks. And digital is a big thing for migrant workers. They spend a lot of their salary on accessing to mobile data. So that's one of another key sort of toolkit that we use to engage with the public. So audience is key. Our campaigns are never sort of the same twice because the audience always shifts and change. So we try to tailor our campaign to the audience, and it can be a campaign that's targeted at simple messaging or a very complex message, or it could be a completely offline campaign depending on what we work on. So these are some of the things we try to think about. Thank you. Over to you guys.
Great. Thanks. Actually, if I may ask you a follow-up question, which has been posed by one of the participants here online. How can we leverage social media to reach youth and other perhaps not following traditional media? Any insights on that?
To leverage youth, I think again it's back to the audience. So for a campaign that, for example, a campaign we're working with Internews on, we're working with different demographics, with digital natives. I'm sure you've heard of digital natives, digital migrants. So digital natives are people that were born into digital, and digital migrants are people like myself, kind of migrated ourselves into the digital world a bit older. So we working with them, understanding how they consume media, and it's very, very different to how we use. They have various different social media accounts. They have 3 or 4 Twitter accounts, Instagram. So it's really understanding how they use communications and how they share. And then we design that, we tailor that to their needs. So we ourselves are not the experts. So we have to try to understand them, and then we incorporate them into our design of campaigns, and we they help us drive those campaigns towards success. Yeah.
Great. Thanks. Margie, I'm going to come back to you. We're all sort of living in this world of competitive demands, interests, and markets. And if you look at media, the stories are changing every single day. A month ago, we were all sort of talking about COVID and its impact in India. We're talking about Uyghurs in China, Israel, Palestine, Belarus. I mean, the stories are changing, every single day. And if you look at these kind of stories, what's happening with the people, in some ways it seems like, what story do we pick from, right? It's also the pressures that the media houses have, or if not just the pressures, it's also about what's the news. And this, what you said, I think Roswell also said that the situation is, there. You mentioned how it was kind of a hidden secret that this situation was already prevalent. In that kind of an environment, how do you really bring about these stories that require investment, both, not just in terms of the finances, but then also the time that is required? Priyanka talked about the pressures that journalists have in terms of time. What advice would you have for journalists who cover or would want to cover human rights? I mean, where should they start? And I think most importantly, how do you convince your editors to to invest in the stories, particularly that required more time and sort of more, I think a lot more time, but then also a lot more resources as well. The floor is yours, Margie.
Thanks. Those are all really great questions, and not easy to answer. What I'll do is I'll just give you my experience and kind of how I have managed to do this over the years. I've always been extremely interested in issues of human rights abuses, social justice issues, in particular women and children. For many years in Asia, I was the regional medical writer for the AP. So often I would go around writing about, various health issues. And I mean, I don't think there's any more basic human right than health and education. And so I would often be able to, in that reporting, really hit on a lot of human rights abuses and issues. Again, often within very impoverished, marginalized communities. And in doing so, I think I've always loved with the work that we do, we really try to marry, the narrative writing. And so really putting the idea of the person, or in the case, of labor issues, the workers first. And, with the investigative work, often what we would do, or what I would do, is have kind of these bigger stories going on the side. So I would be covering, I work for the Associated Press. Everybody knows AP, we are the breaking news, on top of whatever story, biggest in the world, we're everywhere. So, I would be, let's just say, in Indonesia, and maybe there would be an earthquake or a tsunami or something, constantly plane crashes, all of this news happening. And so you have to do the daily work, but, you have breaks, and you're traveling around. So while you're out covering this earthquake or covering something else, maybe you have a chance to talk to some people about whatever it is that your bigger investigative project's about. Or maybe I'm going off to Bangkok for something, and I'm going to then, meet up with some sources there and talk about these other issues that I'm interested in. So, I always kind of kept these little side projects going. And then that really just evolved into more. Now I'm, a full-time global investigative reporter for the AP. And so, my editors know that when we start in on something, we just finished this, as I mentioned, this massive palm oil project. And so it was more than 2 years of reporting, which in our world is just incredible that we would be given this much time. But I think that the reporting is very important. It has, we've now shown that it has a lot of impact. People care about it. When we publish our stories, they're oftentimes, especially for the AP, 3,000, 4,000 plus words. That's a lot. And we find that people engage, they read, they're interested. Some of the top stories are, some of the investigative reporting that we do along with, other people on our team. So I do think that there's an appetite for this. I know that every day, I think we are all swimming, myself included, in all of these headlines and talking heads and people yelling, and, it just seems like things are just happening everywhere. But those stories oftentimes kind of flicker, they're hot for a day or two, and then, we move on to the next thing. And I do think that these bigger projects, and as consumers, you can think about stories that you have read or seen and things that have stuck with you. And I think that's really the challenge and also the goal for us. And so I think it's easy for, journalists, we're overworked, we're underpaid. We've just got things coming at us from all directions, oftentimes understaffed. But, if you're passionate about these stories and you understand that they really are important and they can force change, that's kind of in the back of our minds as investigative reporters. You want to expose something, you want to show the world, you want to shine a light on it, but you don't just want to step away. You want to see then something happen. You want there to be impact. And I think that with this kind of really hard-hitting investigative journalism, and again, it's holding feet to the fire, right? When you name these companies, when you go after these financial institutions, and you are, your reporting is so locked down, you basically got it from all angles. It's really hard for people then to, step away from it. And what we've seen with the seafood, we also wrote about the shrimp and the peeling sheds there. Then you see groups and you see civil society and all these people come in after, and really then take this issue and try to build on it. And, we're hoping now that we're going to start to see more of that with the palm oil as well. And there's so many. You've mentioned garments. You can pick pretty much any industry, any major industry, and find labor abuses It's all about, labor's expensive. How can we do it cheaper? And it's at the expense of oftentimes migrant workers, women, and unfortunately, in a lot of cases, children as well. So, I just hope that, if there's journalists watching this, that, they'll be inspired to go and do this type of work because it's really important and it's also really rewarding.
Thanks, Margie. I think it's really inspiring to hear your words, and also, just looking at that these stories are all there, and and also if you pick up any industry, I mean, these are the issues that are widespread across all industries, irrespective of the sectors and the countries that we're looking at. So thank you for saying that. These are the stories out there. What we need is to sort of just go out and start working on these stories as well. Also, I would like to just maybe make a brief announcement here that the United Nations Development Programs, the Business and Human Rights Asia project, we've been working with a few journalists to develop a handbook for journalists to report on business and human rights. I think we are planning to sort of launch this handbook in about 2 months' time. And I know, Margie, some of the authors had reached out to you, and also your interview is in there. So really looking forward to working with you and others on that handbook as well. Thanks. Moving on to Irith. Irith, you talked about this big behind the brands campaign and behind the barcodes campaign, and we've looked at how because these brands were, these campaigns were also targeted at the multinational companies, the big companies. So there are reputational risks. There is consumer pressure. There is pressure that you can create through investors, and it works in a very, very different way. Now, when we're talking about Asia, and we're talking about sort of global economy, the small and medium enterprises, we cannot forget about them. How do you think the success of these campaigns, like the behind the brands or behind the barcodes campaign, how do you think these campaigns can bring about the change in small and medium enterprises? Any lessons that we can learn? Because I mean, for them, the reputational risk are perhaps not as high as we're looking at for multinational companies or the investor pressure. So how do we use these strategies, for bringing in more accountability with the SME sector? The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for that question. Part of the theory of change with both campaigns was really targeting as you say, the big multinational company, but with the goal of having their policies and practice cascade throughout the supply chain and really impact also the small and medium enterprises that they are sourcing from. And what we find with many of these multinational companies is that they're very focused on, at most, maybe their tier 1 or tier 2 suppliers, but they aren't reaching all the way into those small and medium enterprises. And so the goal here was really to get them to appreciate what was happening at the end of the supply chain. And the idea here is really to get them to do good human rights due diligence in line with the UN guiding principles. And we do that by highlighting, as I say, the risks at the end of the supply chain, and then ask them to do the human rights due diligence so that they understand exactly what's happening throughout the supply chain, to trace their supply chain. In many cases, these multinational companies don't even know where they are sourcing from, where the shrimp comes from, where the tomatoes come from. And so the idea here is really to get them to both be transparent and trace the entire supply chain, and then create policies and implement them throughout the supply chain so that those small and medium enterprises understand what the expectations are. I think the other way that we get small and medium enterprises, particularly in places like Asia, to understand these expectations is to have them demanded by their buyers, right? Because you're right, oftentimes they are not consumer facing, they are not vulnerable to the same pressures that the multinational corporations are vulnerable to because they don't have consumer end buyers. And so it's really getting the bigger buyers to put the pressure on those small and medium enterprises, but also to make sure that they have the resources, because At the end of the day, it is exactly what Marjorie said. It can't be about cheap labor. And it's often about cheap labor because of the prices that the suppliers are paying, the demands that they're putting on those small and medium enterprises to get the kind of quality that they want in the time they want for as little money as possible. And so the idea here is really to highlight that the share of value throughout the value chain needs to be distributed more equitably. And by doing so, then those small and medium enterprises hopefully can invest more in the labor and in the resources that they need to be good suppliers and respect human rights. So the idea here isn't to just put pressure on small and medium enterprises, but to also make sure that they get their fair share of value throughout the value chain. And ideally, then the whole value chain is lifted up, and those at the end of the supply chain are able to see the rewards and benefits from that value chain as well. So that's sort of the theory of change. I'd also say, though, that in making the companies more transparent, we've also been able to see civil society be able to engage those small and medium enterprises in country by knowing exactly where the big buyers are sourcing from. And that has been sort of a puzzle to unlock for many civil society actors, right? To understand that it's Coca-Cola who's sourcing sugar from that sugar mill, or Unilever who's sourcing palm oil from that mill, et cetera. So when we're able to unlock it, then we're able to see civil society engage the various actors to be able to then ideally put expectations on those other suppliers as well. So that's how we see sort of this cascading effect supporting and lifting up small and medium enterprises to do better for the supply chain.
Thank you for that response. Priyanka, I'm going to move on to you. There's also a question for you from one of the participants here. But before that, you've talked about sort of putting the communities at the center. So any tips on how can we use media and communications to amplify the voices of the marginalized communities impacted, particularly by corporates? And I think the question for you and I'm asking both the questions at the same time. This is for you and actually other Priyanka. Priyanka Dutt has unfortunately dropped out from the session today. She was joining from an area hit by cyclone, and I think internet is not just supporting there. But Priyanka, if you could also respond to this question, which is about what are the typical or stereotypical biases that you observe among companies while working with them, particularly with respect to media or the role of media?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So I have the privilege of not engaging directly with companies. Unfortunately, it's my team who has to do that. But I think what we find over and over again, and this is something that Erith mentioned as well, is just this gap between policy and practice. And it comes up in every report that we do. And, companies like to point to policy and say, well, look, we've done our bit. And it's always a conversation that needs to be had about really understanding how policy isn't enough. It's just not enough. And I think the place of privilege that we come from as the resource center is just having built up this very close relationship with the companies over the course of time to be able to engage in that dialogue with them. So they're no longer kind of shunning us or shutting doors to us. But at the same time, we're able to hold them to account, and they recognize that that's the role we're going to play with them. So that second question is interesting because, of course, as new allegations come up, sometimes new companies come up in that as well. And we always get blowback from companies when they think that we've unfairly categorized them as not taking enough action. But, we see ourselves as being very fair to companies. Some might say we're too fair to them because we always give them that right to respond. And at the same time, we make sure that we're very clear when they don't respond and when they don't take satisfactory remedy. And that's all categorized on our website. So I think there are different companies and they react in different ways. We just released our apparel benchmark, and a lot of companies who were ranked poorly on taking forced labor action in their supply chains were they refused to comment to journalists when journalists asked them for comment. And that gets tricky because for some reason, sometimes that leads to the story never being published. And I think different media houses tend to have different policies on this. Some media publications say that if the company doesn't respond, we can't go ahead with the story. And that's always tricky because I feel like the companies are starting to work that out, and so they're not commenting in the public domain. And that's why on our side, we're really, really strong on our company response mechanism and making sure that we're transparent about that on our website. When it comes to amplifying marginalized voices, I just want to emphasize that there's a very significant inequality in power and wealth globally, which allows business actors to shape an economy that really does prey on vulnerable workers, preys on vulnerable communities. So any story that you report on that has a company allegation at the heart of it, the story can't be based on what the company is saying in response to that allegation. It has to put the workers and communities at the forefront of it. It's their voices that should make it into the media, and that's why we very much take a back seat. We really see ourselves again as the person who offers solidarity and support to those voices and ultimately amplifies them through the media. As I was on this call, there was a union in Cambodia who reached out to us and wants to be connected with journalists regionally about an issue that they're currently campaigning for. Again, my role as media officer can get quite tricky because on the one hand, my role in itself signifies the effectiveness of it is how much media coverage we get as an organization. But on the other hand, our company policy is to very much make space and not take it. And so that's how we measure effective media coverage. I just want to also say that companies tend to have massive PR teams that allow them to shape a certain narrative in the press, in the public. And so it's really important that worker voices don't get lost within those narratives that the companies are shaping. So to any journalists who are reaching out to companies, who are reaching out to unions, I just want to keep emphasizing that it's really, really important to have that worker voice in there and to question who you're getting your comments from and which of those you're including and which you're not including, because journalists are a very important gatekeeper to information and how we shape this narrative. So it's just something to keep in the back of people's minds. We always say in the organization, make space, don't take it. And perhaps that's something that journalists can start to mull on as well, just that phrase of, even if you're not the journalist who's right for this piece, we'd love to connect with your colleagues, with other journalists who are the right people to take this story forward. And so I think when it comes to human rights, both the NGOs and the journalists need to sort of let go of that competition that usually dominates both these sectors and just sort of be aware that there are others who can do the job better sometimes.
Thanks, Priyanka. Margie, actually, if I may ask a follow-up question from what Priyanka said. She mentioned about sources, and particularly for the stories or the kind of stories that you're covering, the safety of the sources remains of utmost importance, right? I mean, this is where you want to cover the story, but you also want to ensure that you do no harm to to these people whose stories you're trying to publish, but then also sort of not putting them on the line as well. How do you protect and how do you work around that balance where at one hand for your story to be credible, you have to put people out there. You have to have these first-hand account stories or narratives, but then also make sure that their life isn't in danger or doesn't get in danger because of the stories that are being covered. If you could respond very briefly on that. We've only got about 12 minutes, and I would like to ask a couple of questions to other panelists as well. Thank you.
That is perhaps the best question that you could ask, because the safety of the workers is paramount, and it should be above any reporting, above any publishing. It is the number one thing, and it keeps me up at night. I'll just very briefly lay out on this palm oil project. I told you that we took more than 2 years to report that, and the reason that it took so long was largely due to the safety issues. I had to very carefully make my way into plantations when that was possible. But a lot of times we would have the workers come out, sometimes one or two at a time at night. We would meet secretly in coffee shops or hotels. Sometimes we would have to drive hours. And, you know, we spoke to more than 130 current and former workers at, I believe it was over 24 different palm oil companies across large swaths of Indonesia and Malaysia. And those are the two biggest countries in the world that produce, I think it's 85% of the world's palm oil. So, you know, it's big business. It's you know, goes up into the government, very powerful, very, very, you know, wealthy people are involved in this. And so if you're caught speaking out about the industry, it just can't happen. We couldn't allow the workers to be identified. And so we did not use any names of any workers that were in the field. And for a project of this size, any reporters that are listening to this, I think that should speak to the importance that this, you know, the safety of the workers for both the AP, for us, and across the board. And, you know, we tried very hard, even with the photos. You know, we made sure that in the photos, there were no license plates that you could see. There was no identifying factors in the background or even the numbers on the trees, so that, you know, in any way people could be tracked down. In photos, we did not have any pictures of anybody's faces. Now, again, a project of this size, it was one of the top projects last year for the AP, to not have pictures of workers' faces and to not have their names. I think that right there speaks to, you know, how seriously we take this. And all too often, I think journalists, and especially young journalists, they get very excited and eager, and, you know, the story, you know, you're driven by it. There's pressure, but you have to stop. And as the journalist, you have to say, no, you know, this is dangerous. This person can be harmed, or in some cases even killed. So I think that, again, extremely important question, and not an easy thing to navigate. But if you can't ensure the safety of the workers, then you should not be running the story.
Great. Thanks, Margie. Rosebell, I'm going to move on to you. You know, a lot of panelists today talked about the importance of the collective advocacy, you know, engaging with other civil society organizations and the networks that are already existing. How do you think we can build capacity of campaigners to effectively use the collective advocacy and the networks in highlighting human rights issues? I mean, it would also be great, you know, from your work, if you can bring in the gender perspective as well.
Thank you. That's a great question, because collective organizing is always been the way forward in terms of bringing sustainable change in communities. For me, it's very important to address the issue of hierarchies when you come into a place and you're talking about different campaigners. You find that we put certain voices above others, and understanding that these kind of recreating hierarchies, even as you're trying to get people's voices across, becomes very difficult then for us to show this as a collective. So how do we ensure, because it's like you're responding to an existing system where hierarchy matters. Like, you have to be a CEO, you have to be an ED of some place in order to be taken seriously. So how do you consistently bring the fact that collective voices are more powerful than just this kind of hierarchical organizing, and really look at existing movements and lessons around you know, horizontal organizing, and having the advantage of having a more mass, you know, voice than just, you know, identifiable few voices. And in this case, where issues have like a really deep social and political backlash, it can be very difficult to actually maintain that kind of hierarchical activism and campaigning where you have only a few faces. On the cases, for example, of gender, how do you deal with businesses, for example, in different African countries where we as countries, we still have really horrible colonial laws on LGBTQ people, which are people who are criminalized. And how do you ensure companies or human rights of these people are actually, of these communities, are upheld even by companies when the environment itself is like that? So definitely getting us more collective voices and looking at advocacy, both in that community, but also in terms of allies and creating allyship in a way that does not drown the voices of the people at the center, but understanding the risks on who talks when, and taking advantage of those dynamics of societal dynamics, who is safer and who's not safe to speak in and which time. So for me, that is very important, and that requires us to look beyond the hierarchy in terms of how we often come to a place and say, oh, we are this big organization and we want to talk on your behalf because the world takes us seriously. That is there, but how do we actually beat that? Because that is working within what is the status quo, not necessarily setting the next normalizing the status quo of having voice over people whose rights we are talking about. For me, that's very important, and knowing that collectives, that change has always been brought by collectives, smaller collectives, which are persistent in every day, and they don't come here and check out like sometimes organizations do, but knowing and understanding the mindset, our own mindset as we go into situations, and the privileges that we have, and how those privileges can actually downplay the very cause we are trying to advance and work on it, for me is very important. And then finally, looking at when we're talking about corporations and big multinationals, and making ordinary people understand and how to build these small and sustain these small collectives to have a bigger voice, have one big voice at some point, is that currently the approaches of human rights campaigning and human rights activism have very much been disintegrated. It's like you go to places like, oh, me work on anti-corruption, I work on ecology and environmental activism, I work on democracy. And for me, the language of like compartmentalization of rights and not showing this as part of whether any environmental right touches on economic rights, it's a part of the political economy, and making people understand to get out of these boxes of activism that have been created across the world in a very narrow mechanism that says, okay, you're an NGO, we only work on these rights. And how do you connect those dots of other people, of the collectives that are so littered all over, but working on things that are actually, if they brought it together, if you understood what connects there, which is about eliminating violence and eliminating inequalities in our societies and eliminating systems that sustain this kind of violence. For me, the challenge is how do we break out of this pigeonholing rights? Like, this is something is never purely a political right. It's a political economy, social culture, and backing out of this really pigeonholing of rights that is already normalized in our world. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. We only got about 2 minutes, and I'm tempted to ask this one last question, which is being posed by one of the participant. But Margie, this is a question actually, mostly for you, and maybe if others also want to join in. Many a times, the issues that are being investigated are sensitive. How media cope with the challenges of suppression of press freedom and freedom of expression? Any quick responses on that? We've only got about 2 minutes left.
Challenge as well, especially if maybe you're working for a smaller publication. I mean, I think it's a little bit easier in some ways if you're working for like a big international company like AP or BBC or the New York Times. But yeah, the journalists themselves can be targeted, and you have to take precautions and be very careful and mindful of what you're doing as well, because oftentimes with these type of investigations, again, you are kicking a hornet's nest. I mean, it's a lot of money, and these people have, oftentimes what we found is it's very mafia-like in the seafood industry. These guys are armed, and so you have, again, you've got the networks, and then they are connected to these companies that are oftentimes in various countries, have connections all the way up into the government, sometimes very high government levels. So it can be very, very challenging. All I can say is, try to not, at least until you have to, make yourself extremely visible. I think working below the radar and really trying to just keep everything kind of as quiet as possible until you have to then engage with the companies and the governments. I think that's one way to do it. And just do your best and do your due diligence, and hopefully you will have a publication that's going to back you and publish once you've got everything nailed down.
Great. Thanks, Margie, for that response. We are just, it's 6:30 and we're just actually about a minute over our time. But any final comments or anybody would like to add to what Margie said? Great. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It was a great session. I think we have quite a few takeaway. I'm not going to try and sum up the conversations that we had today, but I hope that this is the beginning of the conversations for change, and the business and human rights agenda can start engaging and can start using a lot more media and communications for the development work. Thank you, everyone.